This is the sixth chapter of the book Color Law that I've been reading. So let's see. So this chapter is not that long. It's actually just a couple pages. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it. Again, this is a recorded space for people to go and have just like an audio recording of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And I'm going to start on chapter 6. So chapter 6 is called White Flight. Along with the real estate industry and state courts, the FHA justified its racial policies, both its appraisal standards and its restrictive covenant recommendations, by claiming that a purchase by an African American in a white neighborhood, or the presence of African Americans in or near such a neighborhood, would cause the value of the white-owned properties to decline. This in turn would increase the FHA's own losses because white property owners in a neighborhood would be more likely to default on their mortgages. Well, in the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. The best it could apparently do was a 1939 report by Homer Hoyt, the FHA's principal housing economist, that set out principles of sound public. Hold on. My bad, y'all. Let's see. The best it could apparently do was a 1939 report by Homer Hoyt, the FHA's principal housing economist, that set out principles of sound public and private housing and home financing policy. Hoyt explained that racial segregation must be an obvious necessity because it was a worldwide phenomenon. His only support for this assertion was an observation that in China, enclaves of American missionaries and European colonial officials lived separately from Chinese neighborhoods. On this basis, he concluded that where members of different races live together, racial mixtures tend to have a depressing effect on land values. So this is a guy saying this on behalf of the FHA. And again, he's their housing economist. So he directly benefits by maintaining this lie that, oh, it's just because of property values that we're discriminating against Black Americans when that's not the case. Statistical evidence contradicted the FHA's assumption that the presence of African Americans caused the property values of whites to fall. Bam, boom, right there. Often racial integration caused property values to increase. With government policy excluding working and middle-class African Americans from most suburbs, their desire to escape dense urban conditions spurred their demand for single-family or duplex homes on the outskirts of urban ghettos nationwide. Because these middle-class families had few other housing alternatives, they were willing to pay prices far above fair market values. In short, the FHA policy of denying African Americans access to most neighborhoods itself created conditions that prevented property values from falling when African Americans did appear. In an unusual 1942 decision, the Federal Appeals Court for the District of Columbia refused to uphold a restrictive covenant because the clause undermined its own purpose, which was to protect property values. Enforcement, the court said, would depress property values by excluding African Americans who were willing to pay higher prices than whites. In 1948, an FHA official published a report asserting that the infiltration of Negro owner-occupants has tended to appreciate property values and neighborhood stability. A 1952 study of sales in San Francisco compared prices in racially changing neighborhoods with those in control of group racial stable neighborhoods. Published in the Appraisal Journal, a periodical with which housing practitioners, included FHA officials, would have been familiar, it concluded that these results do not show that any deterioration in market prices occurred following changes in racial pattern. Indeed, the study confirmed that because African Americans were willing to pay more than whites for similar housing, property values in neighborhoods where African Americans could purchase increased more often than they declined. Ignoring these studies' conclusion, the FHA continued its racial policy for at least another decade. So in one respect, however, the FHA's theories about property values could become self-fulfilling. An African American influx could reduce a neighborhood's home prices as a direct result of FHA policy. So what's important from that first section we just read is that the FHA and other people on behalf of white supremacy were so focused in its original goal, which is to oppress and exploit Black people, even at the detriment of like making a profit off the housing market. Like it said, they actually made more money and their home values increased when they had integration because Black people were being exploited and had to pay more just to get the same or even worse. So that actually was helping crackers. But even then, on those conditions, they was like, no, you're not oppressed enough. And it's man, when you think about it in that way, you understand that. Again, there's no negotiating with something like this. You know, white supremacy in America in itself and all empires, Western empires, have no conscience. So you can't appeal to their sense of morality. They have none, like Kwame Ture already taught us. The inability of African Americans to obtain mortgages for suburban dwellings created opportunities for speculators and real estate agents to collude in blockbusting. Practiced across the country as it had been in East Palo Alto, blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline Black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums, and that values would soon fall. I don't know that word, sorry, y'all. And then purchase the panicked whites' homes for less than their worth. So basically, blockbusting, right? You sell the homes in white neighborhoods to Black families at way above the market price, right? And then what you do to get the white houses for cheap is you tell them, oh my God, niggas is coming. And then they sell it for cheap because they want to hurry up and get out because they've already been told and indoctrinated and practiced under this segregation, right? That any presence of Black people worsens the neighborhood. And then also, too, if you deal with them, you get direct consequences on your job, whether you're a plumber, electrician, whatever. You don't want to be seen possibly help, Black people get ahead or to even be in community with them. So they would hurry up and sell for cheap. So the predatory class of crackers was literally preying on the other class of crackers who were actively discriminating on Black people. And that's blockbusting, basically. So Blockbuster's tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, paying African American men to accompany agents knocking on doors to see if homes were for sale, or making random phone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name like Johnny May. Did y'all hear that shit? Yo, so what they said is that these people, right, real estate agents and shit, who participated in blockbusting because they already had their goals set out, right? They wanted to make a profit. And they knew, because of prevailing norms, that all these institutions colluded in creating that they can take advantage and, just fuck with people, basically. So they hired Black people to go and walk in neighborhoods to basically trigger a white flight. And they knew it would work because they're the ones who put the shit into place. Like, insane, man. These crackers are fucking crazy. But like thinking about that, and how far they would go to put on a whole performance of creating this invasion that wasn't happening. And these crackers, of course, fall for it or whatever. But what I'm saying is that shouldn't we also look at our current times and what else are they performing for us to get us to react, to get us to funnel our energy into certain issues, anything but liberation? Like, what else is a performance? Like, why is it that, the trending topics aren't like controlled by the people? We're oftentimes wake up in the morning and go on Twitter and we're told what to be mad at. So what is, what I'm saying? Like, we got to start thinking in that way more. Like, what is this to be mad at? Does it directly serve me and my people to be liberated? Or whom does my, like, I guess they could call it like manufactured outrage, whom does that serve? I don't oftentimes think of that because a lot of the shit that they'll have us talking about for, weeks on end ain't got shit to do with our liberation. But maybe that's the point. So, says speculators also took out real estate advertisements in African American newspapers, even if the featured properties were not for sale. The ad's purpose was to attract potential African American buyers to walk around white areas that were targeted for blockbusting. Man, that's fucking sick. I'm gonna tell you why. Because just imagine, right? You're black trying to live in this fucking white supremacist country, right? Now you're in this town that you had to move to for work because that's where all the jobs are at. They won't even let you purchase a house with the money that you earned. And then you're facing like racial, you're facing like au fait violence because these crackers didn't just tell them they couldn't live there. They would harass the black people on the black side of town all the fucking time. So you have to live through that. And now you think, okay, now I might finally be able to get my family a better life. And it's all, you're part of the performance. You were never going to get the house. You traveled all that way for nothing. You took off of work for nothing, made a risk having a job because you needed to go look at this house. Y'all, I'll be going deep into this because the shit our people went through. Burn this place down. Real estate firms then sold their newly acquired properties at inflated prices to African Americans. Mm. Y'all, they would use our own people to oppress us. Like, yo, that's some wild shit we got to think of too, because I mean, shit, y'all seen that before in real life. Like, you'll see someone who would be used either knowingly or unknowingly that ends up in the direct result of hurting our people even more, which is why it's like so imperative for us to be not just critical for the sake of being critical, but be discerning and like start asking ourselves, like, what is this? Why is this happening? And again, who does this serve? Because most black families cannot qualify for mortgages under FHA and bank policies, the agents often sold these homes on installment plans, similar to the one Charles Vatterott developed in Deprivation, in which no equity accumulated from down, which no equity accumulated from down or monthly payments. Known as contract sales, these agreements usually provided that ownership would transfer to purchasers after 15 or 20 years. But if a single monthly payment was late, the speculator could evict the would-be owner who had accumulated no equity. The inflated sale prices made it all the more likely that payment would not be on time. Owner speculators could then resell these homes to new contract buyers. The full cycle went like this. When a neighborhood first integrated, property values increased because African Americans need to pay higher prices for homes than whites. But then property values fell once speculators had panicked enough white homeowners into selling at deep discounts. Falling sale prices in the neighborhood where blockbusters created white panic was deemed as proof by the FHA that property values would decline if African Americans moved in. But if the agency had not adopted a discriminatory or unconstitutional racial policy, African Americans would have been able, like whites, to locate throughout the metropolitan areas rather than attempting to establish presence in only a few blockbuster communities. And speculators would not have been able to prey on white fears that their neighborhoods would soon turn from all white to all black. The FHA's redlining necessitated the contract sale for Black homeowners unable to obtain conventional mortgages, and this created the conditions for neighborhood deterioration. Mark Sater was a Chicago attorney who in the early 1960s represented contract buyers facing eviction. Mostly he was unsuccessful. His daughter, Beryl, now a professor of history at Rutgers University, described the conditions he encountered in her memoir, Family Properties, and summarized them like this. Because Black contract buyers knew how easily they could lose their homes, they struggled to make their inflated monthly payments. Husbands and wives both worked double shifts. They neglected basic maintenance. They subdivided their apartments, crammed in extra tenants, and when possible, charged their tenants hefty rents. White people observed that their new Black neighbors overcrowded and neglected their properties. Overcrowded neighborhoods meant overcrowded schools. In Chicago, officials responded by doubling shifts. The students half attending the morning, half attending the afternoon. Children were deprived of a full day of schooling and left to fend for themselves in the after-school hours. These conditions helped fuel the rise of gangs, which in turn terrorized shop owners and residents alike. In the end, whites fled these neighborhoods not only because of the influx of Black families, but also because they were upset about overcrowding, decaying schools, and crime. But Black contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested that property to date. Whites could leave, Blacks had to stay. That's the end of the quote. This contract arrangement was widespread not only in Chicago, but in Baltimore, Cincinnati, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and probably elsewhere. I just want to say real quick. So that excerpt I read, right? We got to also understand that I don't like the tone of it because it makes it seem like it's an accident. Like like, oh, it just so happens to do this. Black Americans would neglect their homes. No, they didn't neglect their homes. Remember in chapters 1 through 3, it described how the local hardware stores were not allowed to sell to Black people. So if something broke in your house, guess what? You can't repair it. And if they did sell to you, they sell to you at like 10 times what it was worth or what they charged everybody else. So not only are you paying, arm and a leg for a fucking house, not only do you have to drive 2 hours to get to fucking work, and not only are you getting paid less on your job than other workers who you do 2 times more. So not only that, but you can't even upkeep the home that you have to come to after all of that shit. It's like they wouldn't let Black people have peace, y'all. Like not one moment of peace. And we oftentimes don't imagine, like, damn, what kind of mental and physical and spiritual toll that takes on a person to not have one moment of peace. I think about that often, which is why I can't wait for a revolution in our lifetime. Black people deserve peace. So I only got 2 more paragraphs. Although banks and savings and loan associations typically refuse to issue mortgages to ordinary homeowners. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a paragraph. In Mark Sater's time, approximately 85% of all property purchased by African Americans in Chicago had been sold to them on contract. When the neighborhood where he worked, Lawndale on the city's west side, was changing from predominantly white to predominantly Black, more than half of the residents had been bought on contract. Although banks and savings and loans associations typically refuse to issue mortgages to ordinary homeowners in African American or integrated neighborhoods, the same institutions issued mortgages to blockbusters to those neighborhoods, all with the approval of federal bank regulators who failed their constitutional responsibilities. That's important. So they wouldn't give homes to just Black people who wanted to move in. They would only give it to those Black people who knew they were serving as blockbusters. Like, for their purpose was to cause and trigger white flight. So unless you agree to be used by these fucking bloodsuckers, these leeches, you wouldn't have a home. And even then your home was temporary because once you did the blockbusting, that was it. Like, now you knew that you were now sentenced to live in this house and that it was going to be a slum by design and you could not leave. That is so fucking evil. State real estate regulators also defaulted on their obligations when they licensed real estate brokers who engaged in blockbusting. Instead, regulators looked the other way when real estate board expelled brokers who sold to African Americans in stable white neighborhoods. Blockbusting, the subsequent loss of home values when speculators caused panic, the subsequent deterioration of neighborhoods' quality when African Americans were forced to pay excessive prices for housing, the resulting identification of African Americans with slum conditions, and the resulting white flight to escape the possibility of those conditions all had their basis in federal government policy. Blockbusting could work only because the FHA made certain that African Americans had few alternative neighborhoods where they could purchase homes at fair market values. So that's the end of chapter 6. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and close down the space. I think I'm going to try to fit in another one at like 8. That'll be chapter 7. Same format where I'm just trying to read through and not yell, revolution our lifetime too many times. But yeah, at 9 or maybe 8:30, I'll post another space for chapter 7. So thank y'all for coming. And again, y'all can use it anytime.